just to YouTube. Zoom is going to be connecting to YouTube in a moment. Yep. Okay. We are live, and I need to start the countdown. There, it's going.
Ah, nice.
So people who log in can actually hear us, and they can see these tiny little windows. So, but they'll know we're not officially beginning yet.
That's a very tranquil image, that yin and yang you've got there.
Yeah, I designed that myself. I programmed it even.
Beautiful colors.
Mm-hmm. And we've got people already posting questions, as a matter of fact. Let's see. What happened? What did I just do? And we've got, yep, everything is, looks like it's working perfectly. We're good to go. So we have at the moment 3 different volunteers, maybe more, who are helping to field all the questions.
Oh, great.
They go by really fast. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely.
There was one day when Zoom just refused to connect with YouTube, and I had to cancel the whole event.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but ever since then it's worked. So
It was just a bad day.
yeah, you never know with the internet what could happen.
Nope.
How are you? Are you doing well in the face of the pandemic?
Yeah, I was in Ireland all winter and it was in a complete lockdown over there. You couldn't even go 5 kilometers from home. They had checkpoints and everything to keep everybody at home to try to keep the numbers down. But I actually came back to New York, um, and it's New York is much better. New York is, sort of a third to a half open, so you can actually go out and it seems almost civilized here, strangely enough.
Well, are they doing a good job in Ireland of keeping the death rate down and so on?
Yeah, it's definitely dropped quite drastically. Just after Christmas, it just skyrocketed because they lifted the restrictions for Christmas, and it just was out of control. I mean, you could just have to walk down the street and you could see this is going to be out of control in 2 weeks, and it was. But they've done actually a pretty good job of really drastically reducing infections from like 8,000 to 500 a day. Do you know what I mean? So they've dropped it quite significantly. But I think everybody is going a bit stir crazy, stuck in at home,
Yeah.
as you do, you know.
And you were on obviously international flights.
Yeah, but I felt safer on the flight than I did in a New York City cab, I have to be honest,
Hmm.
because there were 20 people on the entire plane. I had my cabin to myself. And then for 7 hours, it was fantastic, spotlessly clean, nobody on it. And then I get off, and then I had to get into a New York City cab for an hour. So
Hmm.
I was like, I don't know. I think the cab was riskier than the flight. I have to be honest. Subway probably would have been safer.
Oh my.
How is it where you are?
Well, I've had my first vaccination,
Mm,
and my wife Janelle just had her second vaccination
great.
the day before yesterday.
Mm. I've had my first. I'm waiting next week for a second one. Yeah, it'll be so strange. It's this, it's these tiny little things that we used to just take for granted, like being able to just run down the street and meet somebody for a quick coffee was just like the most ordinary thing, not even worth reporting. And now it's like such a big deal. Really looking forward to it. Isn't it funny? All priorities realigned.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this year things will change back again.
Yeah, by the end of the year, hopefully.
By
So,
I should think by the end of the year. Uh-huh.
mm, yeah, yeah. California had a bad run of it as well,
Mm.
because they were so good at the beginning. They were really on top of it, and then just seems,
People wanted to go to the beach
yeah, yeah,
all summer long, and where we are in New Mexico, things are pretty good.
right, good.
The state government has done a good job. The local government has done a good job, and the I think our uh, incidence rate of hospitalizations and fatalities is lower than most states.
Oh, that's good. That's fantastic. Yeah, we got in Ireland just when I was there after Christmas, on top of the fact that everybody ran mad out for Christmas and were crisscrossing the country, visiting everyone they could. The UK strain got in, and that spread like there was no tomorrow. It was every minute and then it was everywhere.
Well, that's the big risk are these new strains.
Strains, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I think we'll end up living with this. I think it'll end up sort of like the flu. There'll be a new strain every year. There'll be a new shot to get every year. I don't imagine this is just going to sort of disappear. I think we'll just end up figuring out how to live with it in some way.
Yeah, I, I think you're right. Viruses mutate. That's
That's what they do.
Yep.
Mm.
Okay, so we've got just about a minute, and I'll stop the screen sharing and we'll begin the program. I think we have probably at this point uh, lots of people logged in. Thirty seconds.
How long is this for, by the way? How long was it?
Typically, we go for an hour and a half,
Okay.
and then we may spend a little time with the volunteers after that if you have the energy.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, we're down to a few seconds. I'll stop the screen sharing in a minute, in a second. Okay, here we are. We are live now, and I want to welcome everybody who is with us. I'm here with Karen Frances McCarthy. She is the author of Till Death Don't Us Part, a story about her transformation from a hard-boiled journalist and war correspondent to a spiritualist medium. We're here to take whatever questions you have. Karen has generously agreed to field questions from our viewers. I know we're going to get some very thoughtful questions, and I think it's worth mentioning that in addition to Karen's work as a spiritualist medium, she is also a graduate student, and she's writing a paper on in the field of English literature, looking at modern literature in descriptions of the afterlife in modern literature. And she's told me there's a whole new genre coming out where the heroes and heroines in many modern novels are actually in the afterlife. So welcome, Karen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Maybe we could begin if you could say a little more about your doctoral research and what you're finding in contemporary literature.
Well, I started sort of looking into what was being said, what was being written. I was inspired really by Lincoln in the Bardo to start with. And what I started realizing when I was sort of digging around and doing more reading was that there's been this very interesting shift in contemporary literature into or away from the ghost that we used to have, like the ghost of Dickens and the ghost of Henry James, where the ghost was this 2D character. The hero of the story was always the living person. The ghost was always the antagonist, who was always just there as a pasty character to haunt or to hold a mirror up to social injustice or personal injustice or whatnot. But the action was always based here, with the exception of Dante, obviously, the action was always based here in this life. And the ghost was always this sort of superficial character like Hamlet's father, who just sort of repeated the same thing all the time. And what I started noticing, with the exception of Matheson's book, What Dreams May Come, that came out in the 70s, it's only really in the 21st century that we've started having books like The Brief History of the Dead and Lincoln in the Bardo, where the action has actually shifted into the afterlife. And this is like credible, legitimate, highly respected literature. I mean, Man Booker Prize-winning literature, and in the afterlife, entire worlds and entire stories are playing out. The lead characters are the ghosts themselves. There's all sorts of eco issues being addressed, but all from the afterlife. So it's just been this really interesting shift. So what I actually wanted to know is what has caused this leap from our physical world and our sort of pasty ghosts that haunt us into these fully fledged, original and complex societies in the afterlife. What has prompted our contemporary writers to start doing it? Because they've been doing it individually. So clearly there's some cultural narrative that must be influencing this on some level. So I got very excited about this and found a fantastic supervisor at UB in England and who specializes in supernatural literature. So I've been working with her and we're starting to really kind of explore these concepts. So I could talk about this all day. I should probably just stop here. We'll never talk about anything else. But I'm super excited about it.
You've raised a really important point, which, if I understand you correctly, you're saying something is going on sociologically in the culture that has provoked this shift that is now being reflected in the literature.
Yeah, I mean, literature of any age reflects its society to some degree or another. I mean, Victorian supernatural literature kind of reflected injustices in society, feminism, all of these sorts of things, the emergence of new scientific thinking. So literature is always a reflection of society. which means is, now we've got to ask, what is this literature reflecting in our society? So that's what I'm looking at to find out.
Fascinating. Well, we do have questions already coming in from our viewers. So I'm going to give you a question now from Philip Bernhardt House, who has also been a guest on New Thinking Aloud. He's a scholar up in the state of Washington. And he's asking, Karen, in your experience, do those who have passed on express particular favor or disfavor towards some religious viewpoints as opposed to others?
In my experience, I have to say no. I've heard other people talk about this, but I think part of this may be because I think even if we look really deeply into the core of any religion that we have here now, the more we really distill ritual and dogma and more we get into the real essence, I think, of any religion, we start finding these parallels. I mean, there's an awful lot of similarity, say, between Christ consciousness and Buddhahood, for example, if you really start getting into that. And I think when we start getting down to the essence of any religion, there's so much commonality between them on that fundamental level that it kind of doesn't surprise me that people get to the spirit world and have that experience. So I've never, in answer to Philip, I've never actually come across somebody who's saying, no, I don't like Muslims, or I don't like shamans, or I've never come across that at all.
What about people who just say, I had a more orthodox or rigid religious viewpoint, but now that I'm here on the other side, I realize it's more complex?
Yeah, I think I think across the board, not just in terms of religion, but I think in terms of our culture and our society. I mean, we're all coming from different areas. I mean, you come from one country or the other, we're going to have different culture and different traditions. And that's really becomes very much ingrained into us. And when we get to the spirit world, what I've known in my experience is we don't just change like that. We change gradually in the spirit world over time. And I kind of don't even like the term the spirit world, because it kind of implies it's somewhere else. I really do feel we're just interdimensionally here. So excuse me when I say the spirit world. When we get into that form, let me say, I don't believe, and what I've noticed even in my own relatives, my own mother, my own fiance as well, is we still take our cultural conditioning with us. And I've noticed that it becomes over time that begins to fall away. And it begins to fall away at different times for different people. Does that answer the question, or does that sound a bit vague? I guess what I'm saying really is we are influenced by more than just religion. So all of these influences become part of who we are. And then over time, we start to evolve and grow out of these in this form, in this life, in the physical world, and also in the next. So I feel like it's a continuous process of changing, transformation, and evolution.
That's a good answer. Here's a question from Megan, who is actually also one of our volunteers. And she asks, when a soul reincarnates, are they still available as the personality that you once knew?
What a question, Megan. So this is a huge question, and it kind of raises the issue between Western thought and Eastern thought, where Eastern thought is really where the idea of reincarnation emerged from, and that we go through these different incarnations until we become so evolved and so enlightened that we can just end up like the Buddha in nirvana. And then we've got the Western concepts of we die, we go to heaven, and we continue on in that linear sort of process. And I've noticed a lot, we have tried very much in society to mesh these two very, very divergent concepts together. And it raises this very interesting question. If my mother, for example, is in the spirit world and I can still communicate with her, and in fact, my great grandmother is in the spirit world and I can still communicate with her, how can she be there if there is such a thing as reincarnation? Would she not be back here as well? So there's no easy answer to this. I know my personal sense is that we just continue to go in different forms in different states. I know Edgar Cayce had this notion of the soul group, where you could have 200 souls in one group and they all come through and everybody stays in the spirit world until the last of the 200 arrives. And then there's this sort of new sort of thought which is coming up a lot with the scientists, with the, or people who are scientifically leaning, is that we are multifaceted and multidimensional beings, and that we can be in the spirit world and back here at the same time. Now, and that raises the question I believe Megan asked, if I can be there, over there, and back here at the same time. If my mother can be there and here at the same time, is it the same person? And I have to just say, this is just my personal experience, my personal opinion. I have to kind of defer to the sort of the Zen Buddhist, the Thich Nhat Hanh on this, where he says the wave and the water are the one, So a wave will arise out of the water, and it's still the water, and then it will go back into the water, and it will arise again out of the water. And the question is it the same wave? Right. And that's, I know it's a bit of an obscure, very Zen sort of answer, but I actually do feel that the idea, for me, I have not found that my great grandmother is there, and I have not, experienced her here. I think we are multidimensional. I think our concept of consciousness and existence is so beyond the ability of language to express our understanding to, of life, beyond the absolutisms of 3 dimensions and the linear concept of time, that it's very difficult to understand. I do feel that it is possible for us to be multidimensional beings, but is when Karen died, me particularly going to reincarnate, I would have to say, I don't feel that could be consistent with what I had experienced. The same Karen experience, arises. So there's a different form of energy would arise, or a different, being out of that, like a different wave can arise. But I'm not sure that me, that self-identifies as Karen Francis McCarthy, will be running around the planet again.
Well, it sounds to me, Karen, that you're very sympathetic to the Buddhist point of view.
Yeah, I did practice Zen for a long time. And I just want to say that Zen, it's non-theistic. Zen, actually, there is no concept of afterlife in Zen, or individual survival in Zen. Zen is sort of, you arise out of the water and you just return to the water. That in itself isn't necessarily consistent with my experience, because I practiced Zen before my Johann died, as you know, and before that sort of realization that he was still communicating, that his individually still existed. So that wasn't consistent with my Zen practice. So I've always been teetering between the two, but I do tend to lean towards Buddhist philosophy. Yeah.
Here's a question from Jerry Kettle, who is referring to a previous live stream guest, August Goforth. And August, according to Jerry, stated that reincarnation is not necessary, and in fact, it rarely happens. And not that it never happens, but do you agree with that? Do you have a similar impression?
I would have to say I do have a similar impression. Like one of the first people I read when I realized that consciousness actually survives death in somehow intact was Andrew Jackson Davis, who was around upstate here around Poughkeepsie in the sort of mid 1800s. And he was the one who's considered the person who sort of told the world that spiritualism was going to arise, which also emerged out of upstate New York here as well. And he got into very detailed descriptions of what he called the Summerland, which was the different stages of existence after we physically die. And that has always resonated with me more, that we don't need to come back here. Why would we need to come back here necessarily? That we can continue to grow and evolve, that we don't have to keep popping back here to learn a lesson. We can learn a lesson on other states. I mean, even, Jürgen Zue, who does a lot of he talks a lot about OBEs, has talked about that, about all of these different levels he's encountered as he's done all of this traveling through the planes. That I do believe you can continue to learn and evolve through the planes without having to keep popping back here. So I have to say, that is more consistent with my experience. It certainly does resonate with me more.
Very good. And now a question from Laura Hovey Newbert, who is also one of our volunteers. And she asks, can you talk about the abilities of authentic mediums versus she calls them posers, or I don't know exactly what she means by posers, out and out frauds, or maybe people who think they are authentic mediums but are not.
Mm. Well, big question. Well, it is very, I've come across this. It's very easy, first of all, for people to perceive all sorts of things and think that there's something paranormal going on. I mean, you can sit and there's a guy called Darren Brown in England, and he has sat and given these supposed side. Now he's not trying to make out like a medium. He's trying to actually debunk it, and he has sat in front of people and pretended to be a medium who didn't know, and given them all this sort of, he was able to use all this sort of different information that was suggestive, that made them believe it was somebody in front of them. But there is a huge difference between the information that somebody who is genuinely receiving and transmitting information from a loved one can share. There's a huge difference in the specificity, in the complexity of character and all the nuances of character that can be shared and perceived by the medium, than somebody who's just sitting here and kind of cold reading or making it up. There is also the issue that there can be psychics. Now, psychics have that ability, they have that sixth sense, they have the ability of some level of telepathy, but only with people in physical form. So they generally are not communicating with mediums. So they say like all mediums are psychic because you need the psychic faculties to be able to make that communication, but not all psychics are mediums, because not all psychics will communicate with those out of form. In spirit form, they can communicate with each other. Again, there's a big difference in if you sit in some, and this has happened to me, where I've sat in front of a psychic who has given me amazing detail about, say, my mother's passing. And you could swear, if you didn't know any better, she was getting this information from my mother. But it was very clear because I couldn't get any sense of presence or any of my mother's presence, and I couldn't get any sense of intelligence behind the communication. It was just a lot of detail. And immediately I knew this person's working psychically for me. They're just reading my aura, they're picking up my memories, and they're passing. The truth is, Jeff, there are an awful lot of psychics who don't realize they're doing that. And it takes an awful lot of training to be able to recognize the subtle differences between communication from somebody, the nuanced communication from somebody in physical form and somebody in spirit form. And I mean, when I spent a lot of time at the Art of Finlay College just outside London, and that was something we spent hours with. Here is a name of a person on their feet. Here is a name of a person in spirit form. Which one is which? And having to sit and communicate hours upon hours upon hours to be able to recognize the subtle differences in those. So if I'm answering the question properly, I would say there are, of course, there are out and out frauds. But there are also well-meaning psychics who just don't realize they're not connected to the spirit world. But the more you understand the nature and the subtlety of the communication, the more you're able to recognize yourself, the difference between what's being conveyed, whether or not that's just my memories you're just feeding back to me, or whether there's actually a complexity and a subtlety and nuances coming through, which means it's going to be coming from somebody in spirit form. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Well, it sounds like what you're saying to begin with is that mediumistic communication with a departed spirit is very different than telepathic communication with a living person.
Feels very different, yeah. But you really do need to work with both forms of communication quite a lot to recognize the subtlety in the differences. I know if I'm working and if I'm in the middle of a sitting with somebody and all of a sudden I can feel, you know what, I think I just got that myself psychically. I don't feel like your father just told me that. So the difference is that I think it's, if you're getting the psychic information, that's okay as long as you're honest about it. You know, as long as, because somebody is going to weigh information or advice from their father, probably if they had a good relationship with them, they're going to put much greater emphasis and importance on that than on me giving a piece of psychic information. So if you give them the choice, no, this is definitely from your dad. I know this, you're definitely your dad saying this, versus, no, I think I just picked that up myself from the ether, from wherever. At least it gives the sitter the power to go, you know what, it still makes sense, doesn't matter. I'll take it, you know, it's useful. I think once you're honest about where it's coming, once you know where it's coming from, and once you're honest about it, that's fine.
Let's talk for a moment also about the training that you had at the Arthur Findlay College. How long did that training in mediumship run for?
Well, I mean, I started off, they have an online school, which is where I started when I kind of came into it first. And then I would go over to the college a couple of times a year in between in person. And then I did their certification program, which took basically 4 years. I did all of the training and the assessments in mediumship, speaking, public speaking, and healing. So all together, doing all of the all of the training, all the grammar, all of the essays, all of the just, I mean, some of it is just study and having to, like you're in school, and some of it is actually having to work. It took me 4 years to do that. But I was already developing with the college and with its online school and with various different tutors from the school who came here to the States on and off for 3 years before that. So quite some time.
Here's a question from somebody who's called Design Ideas. And I think actually that I could be wrong. I think this question is related to our earlier discussion about the change that you're observing in modern literature. And they're saying, is it a thinning of the veil between worlds? Is that possibly going on right now?
I do believe there is always ebbs and flows in that. And there's always some people who are closer and some people who are farther away. I think all through history, we've had times where there's been a thinning of the veil and where we've moved away from it, where we've moved back to it. I mean, times of crisis, catastrophes, plagues, wars. I mean, I think the spiritualist movement found a resurgence in interest after World War II or during World War II, as well, just because these questions are raised when I'm afraid, when we're this close to death. I do feel the veil is an ebb and flow constantly all through history.
So, in other words, you're not saying that there's something particular going on right now that's different than historically.
Well, I think we have a pandemic now. We have global warming now. We have, I mean, one of the books I love, Brief History of the Dead, is like, I love it. It's like everybody in spirit form in whatever plane they're on, are starting to disappear. And there's a journalist there, for instance, he's trying to investigate all of these disappearances of all of these people from the astral plane, so to speak. And it turns out that what's going on is it's part of this sort of Dia Delis Mortis. It's part of the idea of as long as there's somebody here on the planet to remember you, you exist in the afterlife. But what's happening is all the people on the planet are destroying the planet and everybody's dying, right? And every time somebody dies on the planet, somebody there is disappearing. And there's just this really interesting little eco kind of criticism going on there. It's like, because we're wrecking this place and killing ourselves, everybody's disappearing from this. So this is fiction, obviously, but it's sort of an interesting concept that, and I do believe that ideas of climate change and global warming and where this line of walking ends up, I do feel it's there, even though it's this massive question and we're not doing nearly enough to address it. I do think there is a certain kind of eco-anxiety there in all of us on some level that would raise these questions. And then, of course, we've got a pandemic going on and, these sorts of things as well. Anytime. I mean, I was in New York last year when all day, all night, all you heard was sirens up and down the streets. And there were trucks, refrigerated trucks with dead bodies in them because there was nowhere to bury people. And you start getting into that, it raises these existential questions naturally.
Well, but one of the points that I think you are making in your doctoral dissertation work is that something has happened roughly since the turn of the millennium, 21 years ago, that literature in this century with regard to the afterlife seems distinctly different than literature of the previous century.
Yeah, I actually think it started, it takes us always a delay between something happening, it's sort of sinking into the sort of universal consciousness and then actually starting to manifest. I think my theory on this is that it really started in around the 60s, early 70s, when Buddhism came, Eastern philosophies came to the West, with the hippie movement, with everyone dropping acid, these altered state of consciousness started there. I think it takes the time to seep into consciousness. I mean, like I said, Matheson came out with What Dreams May Come, which is really a very early version of what we're starting to see more of now, which is the drama playing out in the next plane of existence. And he came out with this book, he wrote this book around about that time. I think that sort of shift in consciousness sort of started there and has continued and has been evolving and seeping and sinking into our consciousness. And it's starting now in the last 20 years to manifest as something different.
Here's a related question from Richard Downs Jr. Can one contact departed souls through psychedelics?
I suppose. Well, I mean, psychedelics produce an altered state, right? So, and contact with I haven't done any psychedelics, to be honest, so I don't know from experience, but I would imagine that the altered state that we need to be in to be able to make those communications ourselves naturally is an altered state. So I presumably if somebody is doing Astra LSD and that's creating an altered state, I don't see why it wouldn't. I think, probably the person to go listen to on this subject is probably Ram Dass, because he's done quite a lot of acid and has had a lot of these experiences with Maharaj, and he's talked about it a lot. I don't, theoretically, I think it should be possible. For myself, it has happened organically. But I would say if you're interested in that subject, probably Ram Dass is your guy.
Well, I can say I took a lot of psychedelics now that I think about it. I had all sorts of altered state experiences, but personally, I never tried to and never accidentally ended up contacting any departed individuals while under the influence. So right. I would imagine if that were your intention, it could very well be helpful. But you have to have with psychedelics, it's a lot about your intention, or as Timothy Leary used to say, the set and the setting.
Yes.
There is, for example, I have a video on. It's called meditation-induced near-death experience. And just through meditation, people advanced Buddhist meditators are able to create a state of mind measurably very, very close to a spontaneous near-death experience. So
yeah, and I think the Dalai Lama has talked about that as well. I think they call it Powa meditation or something, and it's the transformation that's reaching that point. I do know, I've heard Ram Dass talking about when he has done psychedelics and had these experiences, that he's had this fantastic, glorious experiences for the duration of the psychedelic experience, but then wakes up from it and then he's just back to just me, which is why he had said, over time he went to work with Maharaji, because he felt like when he was actually working from that authentic place, that feeling of ecstasy, that feeling of bliss was more authentic and long lasting. And I know myself, these states can be achieved without psychedelics. And for me, it feels more authentic. I think the only thing I've done is ayahuasca. And I never had any experience with I have much more better experiences when I just sit myself and just induce my own altered state than I ever did with ayahuasca. So I don't know, you could try it, but I would encourage and certainly feel that sitting sitting for your own sense of connection and altered state would provide you a longer lasting, more authentic experience.
Here's a question from Mark Reeves. Could a perfectly pure soul in this world be asked to come back in a new human body upon death because their presence is needed?
Is there a perfectly pure soul on this planet?
That's the way the question was worded, and it does raise an interesting issue. Some people say the spirit is always pure, But then again, the spirit and the soul might be different from each other.
Well, I think the spirit is pure because the spirit is part of the one great consciousness, right? But it's manifesting incarnately, which means that it has to deal with all of the challenges of incarnate existence and all of the conditioning of incarnate existence, no matter how much self-reflection and self-healing we have to do in this life, which I do believe is a large part of the purpose of why we're dropped off here. You know, I mean, where do we find a pure soul? I mean, to me, the closest person I can think to that would be someone like the Dalai Lama, who is a very wise, very altruistic, very pure person, and who has had how many incarnations, you know, to come back as the Buddha of compassion to help those living still on the earth. So if we were to look at it in the context of the Dalai Lama, I suppose then, yeah, that would be possible. But I don't know that the Dalai Lama would try to say that he was a perfectly pure soul. And I think he's got more humility than that, you know, than to make that claim.
Well, I guess you could say there are two parts to that question. There's the idea of a perfectly pure soul, but then there's the idea of, if I want somebody to return for, let's I assume he means reincarnate, but there are other ways to do it besides that. It could be possession. But in either case, can I bring somebody back from the other side because they're really needed here?
Oh, I wouldn't think so. No, that would all come down to personal choice. That person would have, like the Dalai Lama, would have to choose to come back.
Okay, we'll move on. Here is a question from Clive Taylor, who asks, do you have any sense of other non-human energies? And I suppose he's referring to angels, demons, extraterrestrials, in the same afterlife sphere, I think is what he's suggesting.
Well, I can only speak to that question from my own experience here in this physical form, because I haven't gone traveling around the astral planes, meeting all sorts of beings. But in communicating here, definitely animals, definitely have communicated with animals. I know the Buddhists considered them a different realm, but I don't. So definitely do get an awful lot of animals, people's pets, horses, parrots, all sorts of animals have come from the other side. I have had some odd experiences with creatures I didn't recognize. One of my earliest experiences was with a little creature that I didn't recognize what it was at all. It certainly wasn't an animal, it wasn't human. It was one of the first beings I came across, sitting in the altered state to sort of communicate with those on the next plane. And it was a great experience, actually. It was a very funny little creature. Made me laugh quite a lot when I really needed a good laugh. So I am aware of that. Have I come across aliens? Not to my recollection, but then I wouldn't know necessarily if they were, I suppose, what is an alien? Do you mean somebody from another planet? Or just a different life form? I've come across other life forms. I don't know where they came from.
It would be hard, I should think, to distinguish between, let's say, an alien and there are many entities one finds in folklore, fairies and elves and gnomes and elementals and various orders of angels and demons. How do you tell them apart?
Yeah, I don't know. Do we really need to? I don't know. I don't really have a need to be honest. For me, the experiences of being present with the person, the creature, whatever it is more important than trying to define them. That's my own need, my own sort of where I feel with it. I much prefer, like I said, that little creature who was hilariously funny. I mean, to this day, I appreciate and I'm so grateful because I was very bereaved at the time, actually. I have been eternally grateful to this little creature for being there. And I've never really felt the need to sort of probe and pry and be like, where are you from? Who are you? Let me define you. It's just that they brought me an experience that was desperately needed. And I'm very grateful for that.
But it does suggest that the afterlife might be populated with a wide variety of entities that we have yet to fully explore or identify.
Oh, I would imagine so. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, also, what our understanding is from even just organized religion is that there are many levels and layers to the afterlife. It's not just one place. We're not just here and then we pop off and we're there. There's a continued flux. And if every carbon-based or physical form from every planet in this massive universe leaves this particular dimension, this particular realm, and goes to the next one, then you would imagine they'll all be there in the next one. We just don't see them in this one because we can't fly fast enough to get to another planet. But they're obviously all out there, and they obviously all have to go somewhere, just like we do.
Here's a comment from Lara Hamilton. I think maybe she's asking you to comment on her comment. She says, by the way, my mother just passed away a few weeks ago. It was a difficult passing from COVID without loved ones around her. I keep smelling her cigarettes all around me.
Yeah, very common, very common. And I will say that nobody dies alone. So even though the physical people couldn't be in the room, I guarantee you the ancestors, the relatives, those who already gone ahead came back to see her. And I've sat with many, many dying people, and there was always a gathering. My uncle just passed away, and he was a bachelor. He was 82-year-old bachelor. And I was in Dublin when he was passing, and I kept saying he was in the hospital, and I kept saying, who's with him? And I sort of knew my grandparents, my mother, they were with him, but give me somebody who's with him so I know he's not alone there, because we couldn't go to see him. And somebody said very clearly, Mary. And I said, Mary, we don't have any relatives in the family called Mary. Who are you? She says, girlfriend. But like, he was an 82-year-old bachelor. And then I remembered my mother saying when he was young, he was engaged at one point. So after the funeral, I went to my other uncle and I said, do you remember, he was supposedly engaged or had a girlfriend at some point. Do you know who she was or what her name was? And my other uncle said, yes, Mary Thomas. And I thought, beautiful, like this woman, Mary, who he hadn't seen since they were in their 20s, 60 years later, he's going to the spirit world and she's present there for him. So I can guarantee you to the woman who asked the question, your mother did not go, she was not alone in her passing, I can tell you that. And smelling the cigarettes is a very common sort of sign that your loved one is sort of there, paying attention and close by.
One, as I recall from our previous interview, Karen, one of the first things that you noticed when your fiance Johan died is what are called signs, that he began trying to communicate through various signs, and like the smell of the cigarette smoke would be an example of such a sign.
Absolutely, yeah. There's lots and lots of signs. If you sit, it's a way I feel like initially, at least, our loved ones let us know they're close by. It seems to be something that's easier to do early on. I don't get that now because it's been 10 years, but at the time, definitely. When somebody needed to shake me and sort of put it, like as my friends we've said before, it was like I had all of these sort of signs, evidence trying to catch my attention that were like burning bushes. There was nothing subtle about them, because at the time I was a devout atheist and skeptic and never would have believed any of this. But there are some really nice books, and I said before, I think I've said before, the late Professor Lou Legrand wrote a lovely book about Love Lives On, and I spoke to him quite a lot in those early days, and he was very helpful with me when I couldn't get my head around the idea that consciousness could survive outside the brain. He was very helpful to me and helped me to recognize these signs. So that's a nice little book if anybody's interested.
I have a question here from, I have a username too. In fact, a whole series of questions from somebody. Yeah, that's a cute name. And he's starting to ask about altered states of consciousness and what works for you. And also, I'm under the impression that in the old days, mediums would go into a full trance. They wouldn't even remember what had been communicated through them because they were in such a deep trance. And I'm under the impression these days that's rather uncommon. People go into what you might call a very mildly altered state of consciousness. So what works for you best in that regard?
Well, it depends on what the intention is. If I'm trying to communicate with somebody's loved one, then normally I'll just work sort of mediumistically in altered state, where I'm able to reach and be reached by those on the next planes. If I was asked to give an inspirational talk, what I would do is I would sit for trance, in the trance state, and if somebody asked a question, then I don't speak until the information starts to flow. I will say for myself, I'm aware of what's being said. I'm not aware, well, when I say I'm aware of what's being said, it's almost like I can observe myself speaking, but it's not really coming from me, but I am aware words are coming out of my mouth, if you understand what I mean. But we don't really see those, like, so we're talking about, say, Maurice Barbanel, who was an English journalist in the early 1900s. And he started in these trance states where he would go completely out. He would just like that, would just be gone. And a spirit being called Silver Birch, which starts speaking all of this wisdom that other people recorded. And then when it was over, Maurice Barbanel would come back to the present, and he wouldn't have remembered anything he said as was. We really don't get that. I think probably the closest thing we have to that at the moment is Esther Hicks, where she has that group of beings that speak through her, but we don't come across it that much, I don't think, anymore. Edgar Casey was another one who used to do it back in the 1800s.
Yeah, my friend Kevin Ryerson, he doesn't call himself a medium, he calls himself a trance channel. And he, to my understanding, when he goes into trance, he can be pretty much out of it still these days. But I am under the impression it's much less common now than it used to be.
Seems to be, yeah, definitely. I mean, there are people who do trance, but also I think as a society, I don't know that we are as open to it in many ways, because I do feel like back when Maurice Barbanel was doing it, or Edgar Casey was going into these deep dream states, the sleeping prophet, and giving all these cures and stuff. I don't know that people had the same understanding of psychosis or psychotherapy that we do now. And I kind of think that when people start talking like that, the first thing everybody thinks is, oh, they're just delusional. And I don't know that we have quite the same tolerance for this or the same belief in it. And I don't know if that's why it's not manifesting. I mean, it's possible that we think we're too smart for that now. Do you know what I mean? It might be why it doesn't happen as often. It seems like there's a big shift now into, like the likes of Dean Radin, Rupert Sheldrake, into these more scientific explorations of concepts of consciousness. That seems to be the new trend, that's arising now, just because there's been so many advances in science. There's so much more in terms of technology, really, to be able to start to explore those. There seems to be more of a shift in emphasis into that sort of area and away from people starting to speak, with the exception of Esther Hicks, people starting to speak. I know I've sat in that many times. And the problem is that I can feel if there's power, but if somebody's genuinely channeling somebody, if you have mediumistic ability, you will feel the power building behind them. You can feel it. It's very, very strong. And if they're just talking themselves, there's no power there. But I've come across quite a lot of people who are just talking themselves and they think they're channeling, but there's no power there. So I know they're not. You can't feel it there. And I think and then you go out into the world, into our secular society, it's very hard to sell that. I think I'm wondering if that's why we don't have as many trance or channeling mediums now as we used to.
Here's a follow-up question from I Have a Username Too. Professor Lou Legrand, he just wants to know the spelling. And there are books. So you recall the names of the books?
Yeah, Lou Legrand, Lagrande, and I think it's E. And the book I read, that's a beautiful book, is called Love Lives On.
Love Lives On.
Yeah, and he's a lovely man. He passed away, I think, last year. But very, very nice man. And a really lovely book, because it's a combination of not only helping you to identify the signs of your loved ones, but also helping you to use that in a tangible way in your grief. So he was a counselor, and he's like, he's, I think he was background is in psychology, so he's got this very nice way of combining these sorts of paranormal, for want of a better word, events, and the very practical utilization of them too. So it's not, I always recommend it. It's one of my favorite little books.
We've got a question here from somebody named Foreshore, who is asking about healing and would like to know some of what can you say about the relationship between mediumship and healing?
I think all mediumship is healing, or all mediumship should be healing, because whether or not it is through actual energetic healing or healing of the spirit directly without words, or whether it is a message of communication from a loved one, that the message should be healing to both the communicator and the recipient, or whether it's actually speaking in an inspired way, it should touch somebody in a way that is healing for them. So all mediumship, in essence, should be healing. If the question is about just sort of spiritual healing or energetic healing specifically, is that what the?
Yeah, I think he's really getting at healing of illnesses rather than, let us say, emotional healing.
Well, you'd have a lot of people that say all illnesses are emotional in origin. You get them, you go like Gabor Mate is a big person for it. Like everything is manifesting out of our emotional or spiritual state. Whether you believe that or not is another thing. But we do know that it's very hard to disconnect the mind and body when it comes to health. But if we're talking about using mediumship to actually heal like a bad knee or this one thing or another, it is possible. There are some people, like Edgar Casey was a classic example of that. Somebody who could actually come up with remedies for somebody's ailment. I have come across myself just from sitting. This is very powerful if you have a group of healing mediums together. The power, if you sit with a group in a healing circle, for example, a terrific amount of combined power can be built to help that healing process. And there has been some remarkable recoveries when people sit in a group with that kind of healing power, that kind of healing intention. I don't know that it's. I've had things where people have had, small things like insomnia or sinuses or pain or this and the other, and I've just been able to sit and just from. It's not me doing the healing. I must be clear. It's a team of spirit healers who are doing the healing, and I'm just holding space for that to happen. And there has been some remarkable recoveries from that. But I have found that when there's a group, it's particularly powerful. When there's a group setting the intention for an individual, you can feel the energy, you can feel the heat even. So it can be very, very powerful, very, very healing, I do believe, on the physical level as well. Yeah.
What are some of the remarkable recoveries that you've experienced in this context?
Well, I've had people who couldn't get pregnant after sitting with healing intention. I've had people with, I've had one friend who was in a very serious car accident, and physically their bones were in terrible pain, and sat with them at the same time with them, and they could feel the pain ebbing when we sat together at the same time. In altered states, the pain would ease while we were sitting there together. I know with my mother. Now my mother had cancer. Now the thing is that if it's the spirit's time to go, I don't know that anything can be done really to drag them back, but certainly we can make the process of passing a lot easier for them, which was the case with my mother. She had a very advanced staged cancer by the time she went to the doctor, but she couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't anything, and I would sit for healing with her, and that was the only thing that allowed her eat or sleep or relax. And what started happening then for her was her fear of death started disappearing, started going away, because she started becoming more aware of the second set of hands that were present, of the unseen. She started seeing relatives before she passed. And so it helped also eliminate her fear of death, because it seemed to have sensitized her also to the gathering that was starting to gather for her, which brought her an awful lot of comfort.
I have a question here from Emmy Vadnais, who is also one of our volunteers. Emmy is asking, can you describe your relationship with your fiance now since his passing?
Well, I wrote a whole book about that, so you could probably check that out if you wanted. It has all of the details, all of the nuances of how we developed that relationship, how I learned to be in that relationship, because quite a different. People sort of often ask me, how do I maintain a relationship? You've got to first of all accept that it's going to be a different relationship, but it's still with that person. I don't know, he's just part of my daily kind of life. I get on with things, and I'll stop and I'll ask and I'll talk, and I'll ask him for help on this. Can you help me sort this out or that out? And he's always present. It just is a very natural flow to it. It doesn't sound, I know that doesn't sound very extraordinary, but over the first couple of years, which I wrote about in my book, were all sorts of massively extraordinary, very visual, very dynamic things. But it's sort of now, after 10 years, settled into this very easy way of being, occupying almost the same space, getting on with what I have to do in the day, and then coming back and turning my attention to him. As soon as I turn my attention to him, I can feel his presence. Sometimes then I can feel his presence, which I know was him thinking about me, and now he's caught my attention. It's almost just like the thoughts, just you're able to touch on each other's mind very, very easily when you have that kind of connection. I know if you read the book, you'll see all the beautiful, mad, burning bushes and the fantastic synchronicities and all that kind of stuff. That was a huge amount of energy he had to expend on his part, God love him, just to try to get my attention, which he doesn't need to do anymore. So it's a much easier way, and I feel much more secure in it now, because I've been in it for so much longer that I don't ever worry about him not being able to hear my thoughts or not being present if I turn my mind to him, if that makes sense.
Well, I know in the old days of mediumship research, mediums were said to have a control, like one spirit guide who was sort of responsible for any other spirits that might communicate through the medium or through the control to the medium to a client or sitter. Does Johan, your fiance, function that way for you now?
No, I think what you said, like in the old days, that was the concept. I haven't found that ever in my experience. There's a team. There's always a team of different people that work with me. If I'm healing, there are 3 guides that I'm aware of. If I'm doing healing, that they're there. Then, if I'm doing mediumship, I'm aware of somebody else. My mother and father are there at the moment he's there. That idea that there's a gatekeeper is an older concept. I think we have sort of moved into a different, more fluid understanding of how the spirit world communicates with us, and how they work with us now. So I've never had a gatekeeper anyway, I'll tell you that. But there's always been a team. And I think most mediums will tell you that they are aware that there is a team that comes in and helps them with different intentions and different purposes.
Because I would think, for example, at least according to the folklore, once you're open like that, you're at risk that maybe some sort of an unpleasant spirit from the lower astral plane will try and get through and be of trouble to the medium, and the team kind of keeps those entities away.
Yeah, that's the way. I know that was the Victorians were big into that idea. I think what we've kind of understood now, and you'll hear some of the out of body, the William Bullman, or like I said, Jürgen and Siwei talking about this. The density of those beings is too heavy for it to lift high enough to reach us. Now, if you've got such a heavy negative aura, you're probably not going to be able to work as a medium anyway, because you really need to be able to elevate to be able to do the work. So I don't really feel, I know I heard Jürgen talk about this, where on one of his travels, he was trying to elevate through positive thinking and positive energy to elevate himself. And 3 beings thought, oh, you're going up, we're going to hitch a ride because we want to go up too. But the weight of them was too much and they all kind of fell down. I've never, ever had anybody come in that way before. I don't feel that energetically, vibrationally, they would be able to reach you if you're in a higher state of consciousness. I had somebody, and I actually did some very dark work. When I say dark work, I meant I worked with some retired federal agents on Find Me, that, you know, the organization that matches psychics with the law enforcement to try to solve crimes. And it was very heavy, very dark work, because you're trying to attune to the mind of a murderer, for instance, and it's very, very, very difficult work. And I even had here in my building, on the downstairs from me, a guy was murdered here one night. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was very much aware that there was somebody who was a very angry, not at all happy individual in my living room. I didn't know who the hell it was, you know. So I just went back to bed. I got some. I just went back to bed. I was like, I don't know who you are, but I'm going back to sleep. And I found out the next day, next thing, the whole 50th precinct is crawling all over the building, because it turned out that somebody had come up that night and shot this guy, and he was lying down on the floor. So he was dead on the floor when I sensed him in my living room. And so the place was crawling with cops all day. That night, I went back to bed again when everything quietened down, and I felt him again. But at that point, he was felt much calmer, because I do believe the body had been found, the family had been formed, and he wasn't as agitated as he had been the night before. Now, I will say this individual was shot because he was in with a bad crowd. He was dealing drugs. So it wasn't just some, you know, he was, but his energy was quite heavy. But once I said, I can't really help you. If ever a time comes when I can help you, I will. He never came back again. I never heard from him again. But I wouldn't kind of vibrate on that level with him. So I have never, ever been worried or concerned about that as a possibility. And I've never had it as a possibility either. I've never had it as an experience, I should say, either.
Okay. We've got a lot of interesting questions here. Judy Chu is asking, wouldn't it be nice to have mediums as part of a funeral home, hospice, hospital process? Now, to my knowledge, maybe that goes on informally, unofficially. What do you think of that idea?
I think that if you have a medium in an environment like that, that medium would need to be trained in end-of-life care or hospice care. I actually did do training in hospice and end-of-life care. I wouldn't have just a medium who just you've got to be very careful. You know, it's like anything, you know, it's like hiring a painter, an electrician, it's like anything. You need to make sure that the person really is understands the gravitas of the situation and can behave accordingly. So I do think if you had, I mean, I know lots of mediums who have trained as doulas, end of life. And I feel like if you have a doula who's a medium, that's a really nice idea. If the people gathered believe in that. Because if you start, say, and it comes back to some things we've touched on here as well, there is an awful lot of superstition out there, and it can do an awful lot of harm. And if you have a gathering of family members around a bed, and you have a doula there who's a medium, and they're communicating this, you know, one way or the other, if you don't have living people who are aware of the nature of this communication, you could scare the life out of them. They could think, if they believe, oh, this only happens because my mother's trapped in earthbound or she's been sucked into hell, or they need to make sure that they're educated as well. So it could be very, very helpful. It would have to be handled very, very, very carefully to make sure it didn't become harmful.
Okay, and I would like to let our viewers know we're going to continue another roughly half hour. We'll continue till the bottom of the hour. Here's an odd comment from David McCarthy. He says, I died, but my timeline just changed. Do you have any comments on that? Does that make sense to you?
I haven't had any experience of that at all, I'm afraid, Jeff. I don't know, have you?
No, I'm not sure what David actually means by that, but I suppose you could say if you're becoming reincarnated, it means you're dying from the other realm and being reborn in this one.
Yeah, or the next one. I suppose you die and be reborn into. I think this is the thing, you know, it's like all of our concept of what death means has to be redefined, because we go into the next, it's like one thing I started to realize after Johann died and I started having these experiences was I went back to Mass there's a scene in the book where I go to Mass and the priest is actually really helpful. And I hadn't been to a Catholic Mass since I was 17 because but this priest was extraordinarily helpful. And I started sort of reviewing parables that I'd heard Jesus talking about in this new light of this new sort of awakened state, or this new level of awakening, I should say. And so things like, my father's house has many mansions, for example, started making sense to me in a different way, where I started saying, there are many levels, and we've had this chant, there are many, many levels. So I do feel we're constantly in a state of dying and being reborn. And we can die into the next level and be reborn into the one after that, and on as we go, until we get to bliss, heaven, nirvana, or whatever it is we want to call that state.
You're certainly not the same person today that you were even 10 years ago, I gather from your autobiography.
Me personally, I don't think anybody's the same person they were 10 years ago, but me particularly, absolutely not the same person in any stretch of the imagination from between now and 10 years ago. Absolutely.
I mean, you've gone through a huge transformation.
Yeah. I mean, I just remember my friends even, like, who has sort of made off with Karen and put you in her place, it's like almost like, am I a changeling? There's like an old story from Irish mythology about the fairies, and the fairies used to have these changelings, and the changeling would come along, a baby be born, and the fairies would come, they put a fairy in instead of the baby, and they'd steal the baby, and the baby that was left behind was the changeling. It's a completely different creature to the baby that the fairies had made away with. And that's what it was like. Absolutely, I felt like a changeling, there was just no, I don't even, to be honest, Jeff, I don't even know how I got through life before 10 years ago with the way I used to think.
Well, speaking of life, we did title this live stream event, Why Are We Here? And I know you suggested that an interesting way to think of it is, why are we here in the physical plane and not over there in Summerland or the spiritual world? We have particular responsibilities and challenges and opportunities here, I suppose, that we don't have there, as wonderful as there might be.
Yes, I mean, and that's so true. It's like, if we are, for anybody who's experienced, the ecstatic state or a state of bliss, you can understand that there's no challenges in there. It's just everything is beautiful. It's bliss, there is no reason to grow. There's nothing there to provoke in us a need to grow or look or change or anything like that, which sort of then begs the question of, what do we do while we're here? And I really do feel that we have to be sort of on the edge of God's grace in order to meet the challenges, to be able to understand that we need to sort of go within and within and within ever more to reconnect with that grace. If we never left that state of grace, we would have no reason to actually have to go or learn anything. We wouldn't ever face the challenge at all.
So are you suggesting then that on the other side, they're always in a pure state of God's grace?
Not at all, no. I do feel like when you get, like the Buddha, 500 lifetimes, or 7 layers of the afterlife, and you get to nirvana, you're in a state of complete grace. I feel like the path to getting there is quite a long path. And I feel like it seems to me, if we just look around the world we're in at the moment, that we're all at different stages. Some people are willing to sit, to surrender, to acknowledge that they know nothing. Some people need to get out and control their future and control everything. Some people need to surround themselves with a lot of materialism, a lot of ego gratification. Some people are willing to surrender the ego. I do believe that state of disparity of the different stages exists within this realm and will exist in all future realms as well. all on different levels. So I do feel that while we are here, we are faced with all sorts of challenges that we can choose to respond to or not choose to. We can choose to respond to them by way of growth, or we can choose to not. If somebody annoys us, we can choose to learn the art of forgiveness. We can choose to learn to look at the spirit in that person, or we can go and punch them in the nose. It's a choice, what we decide to do with the challenges facing us. And I think those choices are what help us evolve, what help us grow, what help us develop. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I think that was a very good answer. And I've got a question here from Richard Downs Jr., who asks for your take on schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness. Do you think that those are spirit infestations, for example?
Well, I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I can't really, in any real educated or with any level of authority, speak to mental health. The most I can say is that it does seem to me that there is schizophrenia, there is mental health for a whole variety of issues. All I can really speak to on that is some ideas of delusion where people have a truth. This happens especially with children, where they see spirits at the end of the bed, or they're talking to people and they're written off as imaginary friends. And then it'll get to a point where if they continue to see this, then they're taught to be delusional in some way. And that can be misunderstood as mental ill health, not mental illness. But I do believe mental illness does exist in and of its own, in its own right, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, you've got brain dysfunctions, chemical dysfunctions, all sorts of reasons why that would happen. That's got nothing to do with the spirit forms at all.
Okay, I have a question here from Lara Hamilton, who is asking, what is your opinion of the soul's journey after death?
Well, it's quite a broad question. The journey, I really feel, goes on, and it's like we've kind of touched on this before. Do we choose to come back? Do we choose to keep going? I think for the most part, and we talked, I think August had said this as well. I know Andrew Jackson Davis was a proponent of this. It's the concept that resonates with me, is that we continue this journey through realms in a consistent state. I mean, they say there are 7 realms. Like, I think there were 7 mansions. 7 just seems to be the magical world. How many little realms are within each of those 7? Who knows? But I do feel there is a constant journey through planes and through states of existence that will probably be more thought responsive, more perception, created by perception, more fluid than this one is at the moment. I do feel that what I've noticed just in communicating with people, you can have somebody whose father was, and this has happened, I've had somebody whose father was very, very abusive man, for example, when he was here. It took nearly 20 years for him to communicate with his daughter. And when he did come to communicate, he was very sheepish. He was very remorseful. But it seemed like it took him 20 years to get to the point of being able to take personal responsibility for how terrible a person he had been on the planet. But it got there, but it took him 20 years. But then you have somebody else in the back 2 days later, and they can pop in and I love you and I'm sorry. Again, I believe it becomes about awareness, about where our own soul's evolution is on this, about how willing we are to surrender the ego, to be open, to listen. The more rigid we are, the harder it's going to be, I do feel. What I have noticed is that, and I've experienced this myself, is that whatever we're carrying with us here in this plane seems to be magnified when we get to the next one. So it's almost as if what is going on within us here on this plane becomes our reality, and that we have all sorts of unconscious impetuses, and we say this all the time, how we think creates our reality. So if you're a very, very negative person, you're going to surround yourself probably with negative people, a lot of aggression and whatnot. If you're a very positive person, that'll reflect back to you in this planet. Well, it's almost like that goes even more so in more fluid dimensions as we move along. And I have kind of felt this myself in those experiences in deep states of attunement, where it's almost like our inner reality here becomes our outer reality there. So whatever we're still dragging with us from here that's not resolved is going to be there in full force when we get there. So the more we can start dealing with those unconscious impulses and our unconscious and our subconscious realities here, and find the essential truth in our nature and that essential sense of oneness and being with people, the less that's going to sort of be amplified when we get to the next realm. And so it would stand to reason that that sort of process would continue as we continue to evolve, get closer and closer to God or the Tao, Nirvana, whatever your word is for that state of oneness, interbeing.
Good answer. And here's an interesting question from Kim Brooks, who wants to know, why did I have weird experiences when my father drowned? I woke up at the precise time gasping for air. When I saw his body at the viewing, I could see his emotions on his face: anger, sadness, and fear.
Mm-hmm. That happens quite a lot, actually, where you've got this sort of like connection with your father. You've got this sort of telepathic, very, very deep spiritual connection with somebody. And I felt this from my aunt when she passed. And there has been a lot of people have had these experiences. Well, not a lot, but it does happen, where you can, because of the bond, because of the oneness, the sense of interbeing, we think the father is separate from you, but actually we're all connected together. We know this. And so parent-child connection is going to be particularly strong. And you would very easily, especially if it's something that has that kind of impact, it's not sort of a slow passing through illness, for example, where everyone has time to adjust, where it's just this dramatic and very impactful episode. It's quite common that the bond and the telepathic communication between you and your father will bring forth something that's strong. I mean, when I remember the Fukusitsu, was that was it, the meltdown in Japan, and it was followed by an earthquake. Fukushima, followed by the earthquake. I remember just before that happened, I started having very strange dreams about being drowned in these really horrible, violent ways. And I found out afterwards, a lot of people were having that. It's almost like the energy is already rippling through our collective consciousness and we're picking that up. And I feel like that's what's happening there in the connection between you and your father. It happens quite a lot when there's a very, very close connection like that, or you actually feel it. Why you perceived those expressions on your father's face, I don't know. I would have to have been there to know. I know that your father did not go alone, so I know he wouldn't have been lost, abandoned, or sort of left wondering, how did I end up here? I know he would have been met at that point. Those in spirit form always know before us when that departure is going to happen, to be there. I have never experienced a passing, and I don't know anybody who has, where somebody hasn't been met. So I'm not sure why he would have perceived that. The only thing I would say, it's possible he did feel those things, but I also wonder if it might have been perception. So I don't know if you want to sit and reflect on that. It could have been just your expectation or perception of that, or it could have been there. But I wouldn't really know, to be honest, without actually being able to see what was going on myself.
And here's a question from Suzanne Taylor. She's going back to your description of the major life change. I think you described it as if a changeling had been placed in your body. And so she's asking, were you able to keep your friends after going through such a dramatic change?
Really good question. I lost quite a lot of them, I have to say, and I gained quite a few more. It's something that I do feel happens quite a lot to a lot of people in life. When you undergo these radical transformations and these massive shifts in perspective and in philosophy and belief, there are an awful lot of people don't understand that. And what happens is that my tolerance for hiding it or pretending it wasn't there just to appease them got thinner and thinner, to the point where I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening anymore. And then that created some tension, some conflict. They couldn't understand me. I didn't want to have to pretend to be able to keep the peace. And so you end up just having to part ways. That said, I did come across a few friends who had been sort of more casual friends of mine, who, when I told them these stories, it turned out that they'd had these, they were very interested, and they have grown to be much closer friends of mine over time. And then, of course, I just ended up also meeting new people and sort of ending up with curating a new tribe or new family, so to speak. But I think that's important. I think that anytime we grow in any way, we're going to outgrow some people, they'll outgrow us, and that's just the nature of being, I believe. But I did lose quite a few friends, I must say.
Okay, and Francis Poulenc wants to know about computers. That is to say, do they have computers on the other side? You know, there's all of this discussion about ITC and EVP, instrumental trance communication and electronic voice communication. The suggestion is that there are scientists on the other side helping people to communicate, at least through electronic equipment that we have on this side. Do you have any insights about that?
I would say first to the scientists, yes, I would imagine there would of course be scientists here, there'll be scientists there. If you're a scientist here, I'm sure, unless you hated being a scientist, you'll probably still have that interest there. I think in a world where we don't have three-dimensional beings, where we don't have three-dimensional anything, where we don't have atoms, for example, I don't know that you would actually physically have an EVP or have any kind of machinery. I believe everything is consciousness. So I do feel that there quite possibly are people helping people communicate. But I would imagine it would be by using consciousness to communicate through various different machines here. But I can't imagine there would be enough atoms compiling to form something tangible like that in the spirit world. I could get there and be wrong, but I haven't seen it in my travels there. Anytime I've been there, I haven't heard about it from other people. But I would definitely say there are people who are helping people to communicate.
And Badger Matt is asking, do spirits live in a realm or dimension that is timeless? Now, you mentioned there are no atoms there, so it's a non-physical world. It's a world of consciousness. Is it also timeless? What else can you tell us about that world?
Well, it's next to impossible for us to try to conceptualize an existence without time. It's impossible for us. But anytime I've experienced a really deep state of attunement and oneness for those moments I have had, it's almost, the trouble with it is that language breaks down when we start trying to discuss these concepts, right? Because language is designed to describe what's within our field of reference, within our frame of reference. And we start trying to get outside our frame of reference, we find there is no language for it, right? So there is the unfortunate problem that we do break down. We kind of here, because of the nature of our existence here, 3 dimensions is an absolute. We feel, if I try to walk over there, I know I can think, oh, well, this is all just an illusion. But if I try to walk over there, I'm going to walk into that wall. And I know that. And we also think that time is linear because this is all we know. So when we start getting into concepts of non-linear time, it's almost impossible to understand that. How can there not be a moment after this one, right? What it seems that there does seem to be multi-dimensional existence and multi-dimensional. And I know people have talked about I've actually met 2 people who many years ago who felt in an altered state, who felt so me. I was sure they were me, but they were from completely different eras, but they felt like me. It was very hard to describe, but I actually feel I was coming face to face with 2 people from 2 different eras that were me. So I'm not doing a very good job, I realize, of answering this question, but I do know that we are told there is no time. We are told that time is the fourth dimension of the physical world and does not exist outside the physical world. And in a way, it's kind of befuddling, but also I feel like quite exciting to be able to think of ways of existing that are multidimensional rather than linear, single linear paths. I probably haven't helped very much with that answer, but I hope it answers somewhat your question.
Well, I know, Karen, when we were talking earlier, you made a point of saying that you're not really an out-of-body traveler.
No.
And so it's not as if you've been a psychonaut or an explorer in the Bardo Plains, mapping it out.
Yeah.
However, you are a student of the modern literature, the way modern writers of fiction are beginning to treat the afterlife. And I wonder if you think these treatments bear any relationship at all to what you've learned through your mediumistic experiences and training.
Well, what I'd like to, just before I talk about that, just talk about the mediumistic experience. You see, I actually do have connected with that space that is beyond physical form and beyond time. But as a medium, I've experienced that inwardly. So it has been a state of inner being. I've experienced that. I know outer body travelers go off on adventures and they sort of experience it out there, but then a lot of them will say it is actually manifesting from inner perception as well. It's very complicated, it's very difficult. It's almost like they say, I think it was David Bohm, the physicist, said, the entire cosmos exists in one point within one point space, and it always constantly folds and unfolds out of that. So it's almost when you start getting into these mind-bending scientific concepts that every piece of the cosmos exists within one point, exists within every point, we start getting into these mind-bending concepts, So I can say from my own experience, and like I say, it's very difficult to describe because language does break down around this, that I have felt myself being out of time and being present and being one and being connected, but it has been very much sort of an inward voyage, an inward travel where I felt that in my inner being. And somehow, and it's very hard to explain this, in traveling inward into that one point and reaching that one point, it felt like eternity and it felt like everything. And that's the best way I can describe what it's like from a mediumistic perspective, to feel that inherent oneness and presence with all things that is beyond time and space. So that's the experience I've had with it mediumistically. I know if you go to people who are out-of-body travelers, they will have whole adventures that can be perceived. That is a very different way of experiencing that sense of infinity, I suppose is the word for it. So that's the only way I can explain it from my own. I can tell you that we kind of feel because we are ego-driven beings, and because we are designed to survive and to stay alive, it is very hard for us to think. I remember when I heard first, the Buddha volunteered to never reincarnate, just to go into the bliss and oblivion of nirvana. And I couldn't understand, why would anybody choose to be choose oblivion, like to not exist? Because we're programmed to exist. Our egos, they're programmed to exist. So it seems so bizarre that we would want to not exist. But when I have actually felt and been present in that place of bliss and unity, oh my God, I just wanted to stay there. I didn't want to come back into me. It was almost like it was irrelevant. Just being an individual became irrelevant, but in comparison to the bliss that was experienced in that sense of oneness. So I don't know still. I know it's very difficult to explain that. I think it's much easier to explain it if you read sort of, say, Andrew Jackson Davis and the way he describes those sorts of existences in the afterlife. We can see people at school, people doing this, people doing that. I think it's an easier concept to get our head around, but it's still very, very difficult to understand the non-existence of time, of no linear movement. It's almost like we don't grow in a linear path. We grow this way. It's all in an inner path, ever depth, ever greater depth.
I know that in the literature of people who have had near-death experiences, they often describe it as a kind of expansion. They're becoming much larger.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the irony why it's so difficult to explain. It's like in that sort of in going inward into that inner point, it does feel like you are infinity because you are connecting to infinity, and it just feels massive. It's such a nice way to be. It's like so disappointing to have to come back, I can tell you, but it's that paradox of infinity in a moment, really, you know.
Now, you've recommended the writings of Andrew Jackson Davis, who wrote in the middle of the 19th century, about 170 years ago or so. How would you compare his descriptions of the afterlife with what you're reading in your literary studies and in modern literature where they treat it?
Well, in fiction, these are sort of fictionalized accounts that somebody kind of came up with, and they really are using those sort of fictionalized accounts of the afterlife as ways to explore concepts like politics and eco politics and all this sort of thing in the context of the afterlife, which is kind of interesting as well in its own right. There's also things like characters having a complete breakdown of language, and these sorts of things that happened, and it's all very sort of abstract and interesting to me. But if you were to compare, say, Andrew Jackson Davis to W.T. Stead, who died on the Titanic, and apparently came back and channeled a whole book about what he calls the Blue Island, which is another lovely little book that I think you can get for free on Amazon, the internet or something. So W.T. Stead was a particular favorite of mine because he was a journalist, and he wrote this beautiful little book called The Blue Island. And there's similarities and great differences between them. And then you have Maurice Barbanel, another journalist, who's channeling Silver Birch's information about the nature of the afterlife. And then we get up to people now like William Bowman and that. There are similarities, but it's almost like the difference between reading 21st century literature and 19th century literature. There's a difference in the voice. There's a difference in the style and the tone and the nuances. But there seems to be an underlying consistency there. Does that make sense?
Well, I think what you're suggesting is that when it comes to descriptions that you would really trust, that you find as credible descriptions of the afterlife, they would come from people in the spiritualist community, even if they're channeling like W.T. Stead did after his own death. This book was written, as opposed to fiction writers. I think what you're suggesting is the modern fiction writers use the afterlife as sort of a literary ploy to begin to address other concerns. They're not really using mediumistic abilities when they describe the afterlife.
No, not at all. Yeah, absolutely. They're using fiction as a vehicle to be able to explore concepts of either the nature of existence, of who we are, of what is reality, or of things like, eco politics, feminism. All of these things can be used as vehicles within. Racism is a big thing, like in Lincoln and the Bardo. But the concepts of existential concepts are playing out in contemporary literature as fictionalized explorations of existential answers, which in itself is fabulous, is lovely and imaginative. I think it's, I really enjoy it. But I think when it comes to actual experiences of the afterlife, then we have to get into the realm of nonfiction. That's where we need to get into the realm of people writing books like Jürgen, like William Bowman, people like that, who are going out. I have a tendency to trust people more when they don't try to say this is how it is, when they can just say this is how I perceived it, because perception is so malleable that one person's afterlife is going to be very different from somebody else's, just as one person's existence on the physical world is very different from somebody else's. It's going to continue in the afterlife. So I think we say our thoughts create our reality here on the planet. I feel like that happens squared in the afterlife, where our inner being now creates our outer world in a much more subtle way. So there cannot be one account of the afterlife by definition.
Well, Karen Francis McCarthy, we just have 2 minutes left now.
No, that was
Yeah,
very.
the 90 minutes went quickly. We had wonderful questions from our viewers. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to leave with our viewers? For example, let's make sure they know how to get through to you through your website.
Oh yeah, anybody can go to my website, karenfrancismedium.com, and email there. There's some of my writing there as well as the work, and different articles and stuff, and lots of other just chats. And there's also meditations and free meditations if you want to sit and try to achieve altered states yourself, please do. What I would like to say, just sort of in passing to people, is please just know that nobody dies alone. A lot of people have come to me because relatives have died of COVID, and it's been a very challenging year for them. But I will say, please know nobody dies alone. Please know everybody continues. And please know that your loved ones are not afar someplace. People say to me, will so-and-so still be waiting for me when I die? And I'm like, they're still waiting for you now. So, they're waiting for the kettle to boil. They're waiting for you to wake up. People are still present in your life. They're only ever a thought away. And please remember, that's how far away your loved ones will only ever be.
Well, that's a lovely thought to close on. And now I will.